The title of the final lecture of this semester, Reconstruction, a Failed Revolution. As you can see, I have a question mark beside that idea of a failed revolution, because leave no doubt about it, this was a very successful revolution. Some historians describe Reconstruction, in fact, as the Second American Revolution, because fundamental changes were made. And we're actually going to start this lecture by talking about the three most permanent, being the Reconstruction amendments that I alluded to in the last lecture, but now we're going to really focus on the first slide that comes after this with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that will guarantee not only freedom of slaves from slavery, but also equal protection under the law, meaning that if you are a U.S. citizen, you are given all protections provided to all citizens in the Constitution regardless of your color, and then finally the right to vote if you are now a male regardless of your skin color. But at the same time, what we are going to see is sort of a continuation and a worsening, if you will, of a dynamic that we saw at the end of the last lecture. And that is the fact that by 1868, essentially, we see the radical Republican vision for Reconstruction, a vision that includes dramatic economic, social, and political changes really coming down in flames as white society, in particular, really fights tooth and nail to bring back white supremacy and ensure that African Americans retain second-class citizenship. They're citizens, yes, but they don't have the same rights as whites. So what we are going to see in today's lecture, in this last lecture of the semester, we are going to see efforts through violence, through riots, to ensure that African Americans do not carry through the rights that were afforded them by Congress. We see the use of paramilitary violence in groups like the White Man's League, in groups like the KKK. And we also see legal maneuvering used through things like the Black Codes to make sure, again, that African Americans are denied certain rights that are guaranteed to them in the Constitution. And at the end of the day, what we are also going to see is that this experiment in Reconstruction will finally come to an end. It's hard sometimes to say that this ends and this begins in history. Dates are sort of blurry. But in terms of Reconstruction, there is one clear date where it is clear that, again, Reconstruction is over. And that comes with the Compromise of 1877, where to secure the presidency in a close election in 1876, the Republicans essentially make a promise that the federal government will no longer intervene in the South to enforce the civil rights statutes that had been created by the radical Republicans. So in short, again, to think about this theme of the role of the federal government, as we've had so much throughout this class, we are in fact going to end the class now with the final defeat of the federal government, if you will, in terms of its reach into the South with the Compromise of 1877. But again, before we get to all that, I want to start here by first talking about the dramatic successes that were made concrete through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And it's to those issues that we now turn. Now, before we get to the Reconstruction Amendments, I want to talk about something very briefly that is very important, and that is the structure of America's political parties during this period in U.S. history in the 1860s and 1870s, because it's essentially the exact opposite of what it is today. So what we are going to see in the 1860s and 1870s is a group known as the Radical Republicans, and you can say this generally for the Republican Party as a whole. They are not the Republican Party of the 21st century, meaning they are here in the 1860s and 1870s seeking a larger role for government. They believe that the Republicans believe it is necessary for the federal government to play a strong role to encourage economic growth and social progress. Conversely, you are going to see the Democrats during this time as the small government party, states' rights party, believing that the federal government should not impede on individual liberty. So I just wanted to be clear about that so we don't look at this period through the lens of the 21st century image of Republicans and Democrats. But nonetheless, let's talk here about the Reconstruction of America and the Reconstruction Amendments. And this is proof, this slide here, that there was a tremendous amount of success. So the radical Republicans and abolitionists, as the Civil War came to an end, feared that the Emancipation Proclamation, which offered hope for certain African Americans to obtain their freedom in 1862, would be voided after the war. Well, as a result, in January of 1865, the Republican-led Congress passed the 13th Amendment, and this officially ended slavery. So here, finally, not only are just a select few given the freedom that was allowed through the Emancipation Proclamation, which was extremely circumscribed. If you go on the internet, you can see just how limited it was. But now we see finally that final step, the end of slavery. But at the same time, this was not enough for the radical Republicans. It's one thing to say you no longer have the chains keeping you down. So what? What now? Radical Republicans were intent on not only providing the ability to move freely without chains, but also the ability to gain economic rights and political rights. So I want you to keep in mind about the different sorts of rights here. And we are going to see this effort to make sure that African Americans are given social, economic, and political rights. And we in fact are going to come back at the end of this lecture and talk about that. Were they actually given these rights? So in terms of the social rights, I want to turn now to the 14th Amendment and talk a little bit about that. The 14th Amendment actually had its origins in the 1866 Civil Rights Act. So in the 1866 Civil Rights Act, this bill defined all persons born in the United States as citizens and gave them the right to testify in court, own property, make contracts, bring lawsuits, and enjoy, and this is a direct quote from the legislation, enjoy the full and equal benefit of all laws. So what this piece of legislation essentially stipulated was the following. National citizenship made state laws void. This would ensure that African Americans, once freed from slavery as a result of the 13th Amendment, would now have equal protection. As you can see on the screen, the 14th Amendment, which this 1866 Civil Rights Act would become, equated citizenship with the equal protection of all laws as guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. And the reason this 1866 piece of legislation became a constitutional amendment was because Republicans feared that this piece of legislation could be changed by future legislation or ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So therefore, in June 1866, the Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which would be ratified by the states 2 years later in 1868. So this 14th Amendment was extremely important, just to reiterate what I've said already, because even though the Constitution and Bill of Rights already prohibited federal interference with basic civil rights, the 14th Amendment now extended this protection against state actions. So this is clearly an example of the federal government becoming more expansive, now putting its thumb on the states, saying that if you do not treat African Americans, or for that matter, any person born in the United States, as a citizen and having equal rights as stipulated in the U.S. Constitution, the federal government will step in to ensure that these rights are in fact given to these persons. So now we have this freedom of movement with the 13th Amendment. We have this social rights given to African Americans with the 14th Amendment, and legal rights as well with that. But now we have two others that are left here: political rights and economic rights. So with that in mind, let's turn to the issue of political rights, because in February of 1869, Congress would pass the 15th Amendment, which was in fact not what many radical Republicans wanted, because in order to get this piece of constitutional amendment passed, it did not include provisions against poll taxes and literacy tests. Now this will come to bite the Republicans on their backside, as we see in the next lecture, but nonetheless, they did succeed, did the radical Republicans, in getting the 15th Amendment passed and then ratified. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right for all U.S. citizens to vote. But here's the thing, if you can see in parentheses before the right to vote, I have male. And this is going to become one of the main reasons for a split in the abolitionist movement between white activists and black activists. Because what you've seen for the past pretty much 50 years or more in the abolitionist movement, you would have white women playing a leading role in that movement to free African Americans from slavery. And now they get here to the late 1860s and they say, what about us? African Americans are given the right to vote, but only males. Women are still denied the right to vote until early in the 20th century, as we'll talk about during the Progressive Era in the 1910s. But because of these Reconstruction amendments, and this is alluding to the image that we see here on the right, we see the Republicans tarred as the party of black Americans. We can see here a broadside, if you will, from Democrats saying that if you support these radical Republicans, you are supporting equal suffrage for African Americans. And not only that, if you can see way down at the bottom of the screen, not only Negro suffrage as they call it, but Negro equality. So here is basically being scare tactics being used by these Democrats to tell voters, do not vote for radical Republicans. They're trying to give equality, social and political, to African Americans. What I want to do now is I want to turn to white vigilante violence carried out by two groups in particular that we see in this slide. So before we talk about these two groups, I want to look at this imagery. And this comes from a political cartoon drawn by Thomas Nast for Harper's Weekly in October of 1874. And as you can see, this image includes two figures clasping their hands around the skull and bones. And that is the KKK figure on the right, the Ku Klux Klan that we'll be talking about, and then a lesser known figure from a lesser known group on the left, the White League. And as you can see, what they're saying is this idea worse than slavery. They're saying essentially that black freedom is worse than slavery for African Americans, because what this means for them is if African Americans are free, they are going to see on this shield here in the front, on the left-hand corner of the shield, African Americans burned and hung on trees. We're going to see schoolhouses burned down. We're going to see children dying, as we can see this African American man and woman holding what looks to be a deceased child. And as you can see above this, there's an effort to make the Union as it was. And below that, in smaller print, it says this is a white man's government. So essentially, we have these two groups working together to return the Union as it was. And they're arguing, as I alluded to earlier in the discussion of this image, that what we have now here in 1874 is worse than slavery. African Americans would be in a much better position, these two groups are arguing, if things were back to the way they were when these paternalistic slaveholders were protecting them and their families against this violence from whites. So this is the kind of ideology that is driving these groups, trying to sell their idea that this is a white man's government and things were better as they were before the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction began. So just in terms of terminology, at the top of this slide, you can see I use the phrase unreconstructed Southerners. And all that I mean by that is we're talking about here, obviously, the period of Reconstruction. And here were these Southerners, the White Man's League and the KKK, using vigilante violence. They were unreconstructed. They refused to allow the federal government to come into their territory and reconstruct society to allow freedom for African Americans. So in talking about the White Man's League, we're actually going to begin a little before that by focusing on the 1872 Louisiana gubernatorial election for governor. Because what we're going to see in this decade of the 1870s is Democrats begin slowly to regain control of state governments in the South. But in some cases, however, the Democratic resurgence required bloodshed. It wasn't just through the normal electoral mechanisms that Democrats took back hold of power. And we're going to see this in the 1872 gubernatorial election in Louisiana, because in this election, a carpetbagger from Illinois, a guy by the name of William P. Kellogg, won a close election, which Democrats would dispute. In fact, the Democratic candidate, a guy by the name of John McEnery, set up a rival administration and organized his own militia. Well, in March 1873, his militia unsuccessfully attempted to take over police stations in New Orleans as a first push to take control of the state government. Therefore, because of this failure, in 1874, the following year, the White League was formed. It attempted to assassinate local Republican office holders, it disrupted court sessions, and drove black laborers from their homes. The most infamous action carried out by the White League took place on September 14, 1874, in New Orleans. In 1874, New Orleans was the capital of Louisiana. And what happened on this date of September 14th of 1874 in New Orleans was 3,500 Leaguers, members of the White League, descended upon the city. And these 3,500, primarily men, were angered by the recent efforts of the Kellogg administration to block weapons from reaching the White League. Well, in less than half an hour, the White League defeated the Metropolitan Police. More than 30 people were killed in the battle. Afterwards, the White League controlled the city, and this included control of City Hall, the State House, and the Arsenal, and this, in short, allowed McEnery to take control of the state. Now here's the key thing, and we're going to see a similar dynamic unfolding in the case of the KKK. This occupation would only last for 3 days. Why? Because federal troops would be sent in and the White League was forced to surrender. And this is key because, again, the federal government is willing to uphold the law of the land to ensure that elections, the results of elections, are allowed to be carried out faithfully, and violence is not allowed to overturn these electoral results. Far more well known of these vigilante groups fighting against Reconstruction was, of course, the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. As the riots broke out in Memphis, Tennessee in May of 1866, 6 former Confederate soldiers in that same state of Tennessee formed the Ku Klux Klan. It served as the military force for the Democratic Party, the planter class, and white supremacists more generally. It was originally formed as a social club, but the KKK, shortly thereafter its formation, began conducting raids to intimidate black voters. In addition to targeting black voters, the KKK also attacked Freedmen's Bureau officials. Now, just as an aside here, these Freedmen's Bureau officials were officials sent in by the federal government down to these southern states to do a variety of things. Create schools for African Americans, most notably, and also to write up contracts between former slaves who are now working on an hourly basis on these plantations. So these Freedmen's Bureau officials were seen as sort of interlopers, foreign elements, this national government coming in and messing with local affairs. So they were very controversial in the South, so not surprisingly, they were targeted by these Freedmen's Bureau officials. White Republicans were also targeted by the KKK, as were economically successful blacks. So even as the Republican Party was growing increasingly reluctant to interfere in the South, it decided that it needed to act to destroy the KKK. And it did this by pushing through Congress a series of enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871. The most important of these was the Ku Klux Klan Act of April 1871. Why was this so important? Well, for the first time, crimes committed by private citizens would be punishable under federal law if the state failed to prosecute individuals for depriving citizens of these things: the right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and enjoy the equal protection of the laws. So now again, we see the federal government, just as it did in the case of pushing aside the white leaguers who invaded New Orleans and took over that government for 3 days, we see them with the Ku Klux Klan Act saying that we, the federal government, are now going to step in and punish private individuals for committing these crimes. Additionally, as part of this Ku Klux Klan Act of April 1871, the U.S. military could now be sent into a state to prevent such acts from occurring. So what do we see in terms of this actually being carried out in reality? I want to speak of 2 events that occurred. First of all, in Mississippi, the United States Attorney secured 700 indictments against KKK members. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, federal troops were sent in and they made hundreds of arrests of the KKK members and forced another 2,000 Klansmen to flee. As a result of these enforcement acts, especially the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, the KKK would be dead by 1872. So as we can see here, before we go on to the next slide here, violence was the main tactic used by the KKK. We see this image on the right here, 2 individuals hung, and interestingly enough, again, African Americans were not the only people hung and targeted, but we have this individual from Ohio holding a carpet bag. Again, that idea of a northerner coming down to the South and trying to change Southern society. Besides white vigilantism, a lot of Southern states also attempted to use laws to keep African Americans from obtaining their freedom, and in particular, their economic independence. And in fact, what we're going to see, we'll see this more so in the next lecture when we talk about black labor in the South and sharecropping in particular, is African Americans, they obtained their social rights and their political rights. But one of the biggest glaring failures of the Reconstruction era was the lack of black economic independence. And I'll probably say the same thing in the next lecture. But these black codes, as you'll see when you read them in your primary sources for this lecture, they were one of the main means used to keep African Americans under the thumbs of white. And this begins already almost immediately after the Civil War, because by late 1865, both Mississippi and South Carolina would enact these black codes. And what they were intended to do was they were intended to define the freedmen's rights and responsibilities. And in short, they basically were meant to keep African Americans economically dependent on their former plantation owners. And again, this is what those Freedmen's Bureau officials that were targeted by the KKK, they were trying to break through these black codes. Well, by the end of 1866, most southern states had actually already repealed these laws, so they were very much short-lived. But then you have to pose a question, as you see in this slide. Did they matter? Well, they were repealed because they only applied to blacks. But after 1866, they still existed. So therefore, Southern courts would still enforce vagrancy laws in terms of where and when African Americans could move about, breach of labor contracts, and apprenticeship statutes, so long as they applied to whites and blacks. So these codes still existed, but now they applied to whites and blacks. But here's the key element that I want you to keep in mind as we're thinking about this. Even though the statutes on the law books now said these laws and these codes applied to blacks and whites, what do you think happened when they actually went into the courtroom? It wasn't the whites who were found guilty and punished. It was primarily limited to African Americans. So even though the black codes no longer existed after 1866, the law still did, and even though they were supposed to apply to both blacks and whites, they were primarily targeting African Americans. We started this lecture by talking about the successes, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Then we talked about the efforts by white Southerners to bring back the white man's government, white supremacy. The federal government stepped in and pushed some of these elements aside, the White Man's League, the KKK. But nonetheless, what we're going to see here is by the mid-1870s, Reconstruction is dead and gone in the dustbin of history. So let's talk about this story to end our lecture on the Reconstruction period. After passage of the 15th Amendment in 1869, radical Republicans introduced another bill the following year in 1870 that would have enforced equal access to schools, public transportation, hotels, and churches. It remained stuck in Congress for the next 5 years, and it would have likely remained stuck in Congress longer, but to honor the death of radical Republican Charles Sumner, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And this Civil Rights Act of 1875 would ensure and require full and equal access to jury service and to public transportation and accommodations. However, and this is another problem we're going to see throughout the South for essentially the next 90 years, due to a lack of enforcement and the law being deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883, it would take almost another century before Congress passed the next civil rights bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what we're going to see is that Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed in that year by Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Congress, is essentially a mirror image of this Civil Rights Act of 1875. But nonetheless, yes, the Civil Rights Act is passed here in 1875, but it's deemed unconstitutional, it's not enforced, and we are going to see as a result, what we'll talk about in the next lecture in more detail, the rise of these Jim Crow laws. So let's now talk about the official end of Reconstruction. And there's one date that historians point to, one event that historians point to that really highlights when Reconstruction came to an end. And to get to this point, we're going to begin by talking about the election of 1876. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was facing off against Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden. And in this 1876 election for president, they would nearly tie for victory. Now, a dispute would break out whether the Democrats had cheated by coercing African Americans not to vote, but that was sort of pushed aside in order to reach this compromise of 1877. This compromise of 1877 gave Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, the presidency. But in order for the Republicans to enter the White House, they had to promise, which they did, that federal intervention into Southern politics would be ended. And as a result of this lack of federal intervention in Southern society, racial discrimination would now be allowed to flourish in the region and thus bring an end to Reconstruction and allow for the thriving of Jim Crow society, which we will talk about in greater detail in the next lecture.